Mr. Fusco, we're ready to go. Meeting is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Gilmer. All right, welcome to our April Policy Committee meeting. I'm going to call the meeting to order and begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Second order of business. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes from our March meeting?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Resch, seconded by Mrs. Stoll. All in favor? Motion carries. All right. Mr. Gilmer, is there anybody in the audience to address the committee?
We actually have no attendees in the audience at this moment. I don't know. Do we have a second audience of citizens?
No.
Okay. Yeah, we don't have any attendees in the room right now.
Okay.
Just viewers of North Penn Television.
The North Penn Television, and it'll be recorded. So certainly, unlike in the past, we at least have documentation this happened. Besides the minutes, of course. Okay, let's turn to our items recommended for work session or action. We have a slate of policies tonight, A through E on the agenda, and then item F is the policies to be repealed once these policies are moved to action, or once these policies are enacted. So, Dr. Bauer, what do we have on our policy plate this evening?
Yes, Mr. Fusco, this evening we are going to offer some commentary on policy 218.2, terroristic threats, 226 searches, 219 student complaint process, 221 dress and grooming, and then 233 suspension and expulsion. Of note, I do believe we would like to have a discussion regarding searches, but before we get into that, Mr. Summers just has some comments prepared about a few of these policies, just to highlight for committee members. Mr. Summers?
Sure, thank you, Dr. Bauer. Just to kind of give an overview of the policies that are before the committee tonight. Sorry, my daughter keeps calling me in the middle of my meeting, which is nice of her. 218.2 terroristic threats is really just the PSBA proposed revision. The only change that we have to that particular policy is a reference to how we will handle reports of terroristic threats that we will, in addition to reporting them when required to law enforcement, we will have them go to our threat assessment team. So North Penn has a threat assessment team that has been put in place. All districts through legislation as of next school year, the 21-22 school year, will be required to have a threat assessment team that's comprised of certain members that carries out certain functions. Similar to the district safety officer report that has been presented to the board in executive session in the past. A new requirement will be that this threat assessment team present a report to the board in executive session about threats that the district has received, about the number of incidents that have occurred, things along those lines. So in terms of the terroristic threats policy, that's the only change to what PSBA has proposed, is just to say that we're going to handle those in accordance with our threat assessment team protocols, which certainly the Safe Schools Committee has been involved in the threat assessment team development and that aspect of things. I think we'll come back to searches because we'll have a little bit more substantive discussion about those. Student complaint process, policy 219, it's a short policy, but it does something fairly significant in that it formally establishes on the part of the board a mechanism for student concerns to be heard. So it calls for students to have an ability to submit complaints, concerns that they might have about things that are going on with the operation of the school, whether it be curriculum, whether it be extracurricular, really anything that students might have a concern about. The board, by establishing this policy, is calling upon the administration to hear those concerns, to have mechanisms for having a student voice be heard. It's something that certainly occurs regularly within the district, but it is significant that the board, through formal policy, is saying that that is a desire of the board, is to have students have a voice and have their concerns be heard and responded to. Policy 221, dress and grooming, is also a short policy that really establishes that the administration may put forward certain rules and regulations regarding student dress. However, any rules and regulations are to have the most minimal impact on student expression in terms of students' ability to express themselves. And it really should only be if student dress is interfering with the operation of the school, is disruptive in some way, or presents a health and safety risk, that student dress would be limited. It also authorizes the school to require certain dress for student safety. So, student shop class, for example, physical education, other types of environments where certain types of clothing could present a safety risk, loose clothing, getting caught in machinery, that sort of thing. It establishes that the school can impose reasonable rules and regulations regarding student dress. It also encourages staff to demonstrate appropriate dress and attire to students. Then policy 233, suspension and expulsion. This is a fairly lengthy policy. We do not have any changes to the PSBA recommended version of this policy, but it's significant in that it sets forth basically the due process that students are entitled to in the event that they are excluded from school because of their behavior. So if we have student misconduct, a student engages in some sort of behavior that violates our code of conduct, that student can certainly face consequences in the form of a suspension or an expulsion. And an expulsion under Pennsylvania law is defined as any exclusion from school for more than 10 days in a row. So a student being suspended for 11 days out of school, that is an expulsion. 11 days or more would constitute an expulsion. So that policy 233 describes what due process hearings, what hearings before the board, what sort of informal hearings students are entitled to. And it depends upon the length of the suspension. So an in-school suspension or a suspension of 3 days or less carries sort of a lower level of due process that those students are entitled to. Basically, they're entitled to be told why they're being suspended and have an opportunity to respond to that. A suspension of more than 3 days out of school, there's an informal hearing that takes place typically before a principal or assistant principal. There's certain procedures that our students are entitled to. And then in an expulsion hearing, there's an entitlement, an expulsion matter. There's an entitlement to a hearing before the Board of School Directors if the student chooses to challenge that expulsion recommendation. And then just the notice of intent to repeal policies, that just repeals our existing suspension and expulsion policy that we had in place and allows us to move forward with the more detailed PSBA version. So I guess if there are any questions on any of those policies, and then maybe we can talk about student search. Mr. Rush.
The threat assessment policy, we talk about the threat assessment team, and I'm sure it was either in the document or talked about it in an earlier meeting. I don't quite remember, but if you could explain to us how long it will take for the threat assessment team to act on a threat.
Dr. Bauer, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can. So normally, and this is one of the aspects of the school district that has veered off course, I'd say, due to COVID, simply because there hasn't been as much of a need for a physical threat assessment in the last year or so. However, we are scheduled to meet monthly, typically. And it's not necessarily, the impetus for a meeting isn't necessarily like a tragic or violent event. Rather, someone on the team or someone from one of our schools makes a referral about concerns related to a student that they think, there is concerning behavior, maybe atypical, not necessarily disciplinary in nature, but rather just concerning. So we would bring that team together, discuss the case from kind of a triangulation standpoint, look at attendance data, look at discipline data, look at academic data. We have some people from the county and law enforcement involved. Maybe they bring some components to the table, and we kind of work together and try to support students and their families. So the way that it has worked in the past prior to this year was we would meet on a monthly basis, and people would bring cases to the table. I see moving forward, actually we have a meeting scheduled this month. If there was a need, an urgent need, we could call a meeting. But in the very least, Mr. Resch, monthly. And then if there's a case that needed to come before the school board, we could just call an executive session if necessary.
I just wanted to make sure that if there was an immediate threat, you could gather the team in a reasonable amount of time and make a decision. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great question. One piece that I will add, I did have contact from a parent and an employee in the district regarding addressing grooming and just wanting to be involved in the process. Obviously, the policy sets forth the authority of the board to set expectations. And then there was some interest expressed in being involved in, okay, what are those expectations? So I have every intention of bringing a group of people together, students included, and staff, administrators, in what are appropriate guidelines to bring forth, and certainly student handbooks are to be approved by the board. But having a process in place for setting those expectations for what was formerly referred to as the dress code, right? But what are the expectations for students at the various levels? So I'll keep the board posted, and this committee in particular posted on our progress, but that would come probably beginning over the summer for us to start to look at that.
So I'm sorry, can I just clarify that? So there is a dress code, if you will, in the student handbook that everybody gets, right? So this policy supersedes that, or is that?
No, so yeah, great question, Mrs. Stoll. So the argument or the case from this community member was that our dress code is dated. And I said, well, we're actually looking to approve a dress and grooming policy first read in April. So once that policy is officially approved, then we're going to take another look at a comprehensive look at the dress code. But I think it's important to have the policy established formally first, and then we'll take a look at the dress code. But we do have a dress code.
I know, I kind of remember.
Yes.
All right.
It might be the same dress code that was in place when you were in high school or I was in high school. Yeah. Yeah. It's been there for a little while.
Okay.
The enactment of so many of these new policies has prompted the conversation about a review of the code of conduct and a lot of the administrative regulations that are to go with these policies. So, again, with COVID being sort of the number one focus of everybody's attention this year, that's probably something we're going to be looking toward doing maybe in the summer, or and I say we, I mean the administration. I'm not writing your regs. But in the next school year, and maybe even starting the conversation about how to, put together a team to do that in the summer. At least in terms of the conversations that Dr. Bauer and Mr. Summers and I have had about it. I have a question real quick about the expulsion and suspension regulation. I believe it's the case that if a student is out of school for more than 10 days, if they themselves are truant and in 10 straight days, they have to re-enroll, I believe, right? Is that correct? I know in districts that have worked in the past, that's been the case. I'm not sure if that was a law or if that was a practice of the district.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Bauer might be able to speak to the procedure a little bit. But in terms of the 10-day requirement, it's actually a funding piece in that the district can't receive funding for a student who has been absent from school for a period of more than 10 days, and they must be dropped from the active roles. It's designed so that we don't receive funding for students that we're not educating. There have been some issues in some cases about how quickly we have to re-enroll students. If a student has been enrolled and then is absent for a period of time, generally we want students obviously to get back into the school as quickly as possible. But there may be certain steps that the district takes when a student has been absent for that period.
Yeah, so the follow-up and the more concern is if a student is expelled for a period of longer than 10 days, do they have to re-enroll? I guess is really what the question relative to the policy is.
Yeah, so the only students who have been through that in my time have had, for example, a stipulation in through the expulsion process where they have to actually come to me and request to re-enroll, and we have a meeting. So it's not like someone could be expelled, go away for a year or two, and us unknowingly have them at our doorstep, and they just show up at school. So it's typically part of the agreement, Mr. Fusco, that they would have to seek permission from either Dr. Dietrich or myself in order to re-enroll.
And I think that might be a point that's worth emphasizing. In North Penn, in the past decade, we have not had a single expulsion hearing before the board. And I think that speaks a lot to the administration, in particular, the assistant superintendents and the way that they have handled student discipline matters. Certainly Dr. Bauer, Dr. Holben before him, play a very active role in student discipline matters that rise to the level of expulsion. I think to a greater degree than what you see in some other school districts. And I think the benefit in North Penn is that the parents of those students who are facing potential expulsion, I think get a real sense that the district cares about how their student is doing and what education their child will receive moving forward. And it is never about just excluding a student or removing a student. And I think that the communication that has occurred with parents of students who are facing potential expulsion has gone a long way to preventing disputes. And so in essentially every instance in which a student has been recommended or faced potential expulsion, there's been an agreement with the family that said, here's what's going to happen to your child in the meantime, whether that is some sort of virtual schooling or placement in another school outside of the district that's maybe more appropriate to meet the needs that may have led to that behavior that occurred. But I think it's certainly something to be proud of in the district that we have not faced, significant hearings involving disciplinary disputes involving students.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that, Kyle, because you always see that on the reports that of the alternative placement or whatever, and I've always wondered about that. So thank you for clarifying that.
One other important note, and thank you for that, Mr. Summers. This year has complicated the whole 10-day thing, right? So back to Mr. Fusco's original question, we do have families who have said, hey, I'm going to Egypt from now until sometime in the summer type of thing. And under Mr. Summers' guidance, residency is really about intent, and whether or not they are intending to reside in the district and whether or not we're actually educating them. So pre-pandemic and pre-virtual learning and a learning management system such as Canvas, they would say, okay, I'm going away for 3 weeks. Can I get my work? Right. And I don't think anyone would argue when they go away for 3 weeks that we are educating them. We just gave them work. Whereas now it could be argued that, well, we kind of are educating them. And it depends if it's a synchronous opportunity, if it's a finite amount of time, a reasonable amount of time. As Mr. Summers guided me through the process, could it be argued that we are educating them and they intend to reside here? That has changed the conversation across, I'm sure, the country and the world. So I've navigated that conversation many times this year with Dr. Santoro and our registrar regarding whether or not students are residents when they leave for more than 10 days. So it's really, we've been dealing with them on a case-by-case basis at this point.
Is it considered, and I'm guessing it's not, but if a student were to go away and just be gone for a period of weeks, would that be considered that they're expelled or just disenrolled, or like what exactly is that terminology?
Yeah, so prior to the pandemic, if a student was gone for over 10 days, they were disenrolled. And knowingly, we would try to hold their seat in their classes if we know when they intend to return. But we do have families who go away for months at a time. And for the reasons outlined by Mr. Summers, because of the funding source, we can't say we're educating them when they've been gone for months. So yeah, it's not an expulsion. It's simply they are dropped from the rolls, or they just withdraw before they go and then re-enroll when they get back.
Are there examples of an expulsion that's beyond a 10-day removal from school that's not much more dramatic where we're looking for an alternative placement? Like, is that something that in practice that's done in North Penn? Like to say to somebody, well, you're gonna be out of school for 20 days, or, you know what I mean? The way that the policy is written, 10 days or more is not a suspension, it's now an expulsion, but it does suggest that if you said 15 days, it would actually be an expulsion and they'd have to re-enroll. Does that happen in practice is what I'm asking?
Yeah, Mr. Summers, I can't think of too many, but I can think of a few where we had a 45-day, essentially a marking period, or to finish out the year, for example. You know, if something were to happen in April, we put these checkpoints in place. You know, if you finish your school year over at this educational institution, you stay out of trouble, you comply with the community, and potentially if like juvenile probation's involved, depending on the circumstance. We'll put systems in place that if the student finds success in all of them, then they're welcome to come back. And it would be more than 10, but less than a year.
Go ahead, Al.
Who makes the decision on whether we're going to expel them or keep them in school? Is it just you by yourself, Todd? Or do you bring it before a committee, including psychologists and sociologists?
It depends. It does depend on the circumstance. In general, it's administration. So it would be the principal, myself, Dr. Dietrich. If it's a special education student, certainly there are more people at the table. And then ultimately we have to make a recommendation to the school board. And if, as Mr. Summers said, if they challenged that decision or ruling, you could very well see them in an expulsion hearing. If they were to challenge the ruling, and it's actually, I've been fortunate enough, knock on wood, I think Mr. Summers jinxed us tonight, but I have not been through an expulsion hearing because we're able to find common ground with the families and support their students. And try to set up a roadmap for success. So, but yeah, it's not that I have unilateral decision-making power. Rather, it's administration ultimately making a recommendation, working with the family. And if it is appealed, then it would come before an expulsion hearing, which is usually made up of either the full board or a subset of the board.
Thank you for reminding me again of the policy. I appreciate it.
Do we have any other questions before we discuss searches 226? All right, we'll tell you what we'll do is, why don't we put a motion to move these to first read in action, and then we'll talk about 226 specifically. So can I have a motion to move policies 218.2, 219, 221, and 233 for first read at our action meeting?
So moved.
All right, motion by Mrs. Stoll, seconded by Mr. Resch. All in favor, say aye. Okay, that motion carries. Now let's talk about 226. And one of the reasons why I asked for a special consideration 226, in the time that I've been working with Dr. Bauer and Mr. Summers on this, it's unusual that we've encountered a policy where districts have taken completely different approaches as to whether or not to enact it, how to enact it. I was more than uncomfortable to make that decision on behalf of everyone. So I thought this was the one that really needed discussion at the committee level, and if we can't come to a consensus here, then perhaps even at a work session. So if you could enlighten us a little on this one, Mr. Summers.
Sure. So 226 in general is the policy that discusses the district's policy for searching students. So under the US Constitution, the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable search and seizure by the government of its citizens. And Pennsylvania Constitution also has a privacy right in it that prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures by the state government. So how that has been applied by the courts in schools is that in general, school students and staff also do have a right of expectation, a privacy right, an expectation of privacy in not being unreasonably searched, not having their belongings searched, not having their persons searched, not having their belongings seized, and not having their persons seized while they are in school. Courts, though, have also recognized that schools are in a unique relationship with students in that we are, expected to care for students and protect their safety and well-being when they are under our control. So courts have recognized that although we do not have free reign to search students whenever and however we'd like, we do have a little bit lower of a threshold that we need to meet in order to search students than, say, the police if they want to, search your belongings or your home. And so what this policy does is it explains what the school district needs to do in order to legally perform a search. And there are essentially two types of searches that the policy talks about. There is a suspicion-based search, and then there's what's called a generalized search. I would say that the vast majority of searches that the school administration performs is an individualized suspicion-based search. And so what that means is that the school district receives some sort of information that a student is in possession of something illegal or that violates a school rule or school code of conduct. And on the basis of that information, we have a good reason to believe that the student is in possession of something illegal or against our policy, and that we have the ability to search that student. So under US Supreme Court case law, in order to search a student, we need what is called reasonable suspicion. You may be familiar or may have heard of probable cause. Probable cause is the standard that the police need to have in order to get a search warrant, in order to search someone. And probable cause is essentially they need to have good evidence to know that when they search a particular location, they're going to find something illegal or improper. Our standard is what's called reasonable suspicion, and reasonable suspicion means we need to have some articulable basis to think we might find something improper. It can't just be on a whim. It can't be random. We need to have some information, reasonable information, to believe that a student might have something in their possession. So the examples could be student lockers, student backpacks, student other bags that they might have, pockets, any sort of belonging that a student might have. If we have individualized suspicion that they are in possession of something, we have the ability to search them. This policy also talks about general searches. A general search is something that's usually done without suspicion that a particular student has something illegal or in violation of a policy on them, but that we have some reason to believe that a group of students overall or the school community overall is in possession of some substance or device or item that violates school policies or the law. The most common example of a general search would be a canine search, a dog search of a sniff. Another general search that some schools have would be like a metal detector search, or some sort of search for of bags of every student who enters a school. As the policy explains, there are certain thresholds that a school needs to meet in order to perform general searches. There does need to be some sort of concern. We need to have evidence of that concern before performing one of those general searches. All of that is pretty routine in terms of school district policies. What Mr. Fusco was referencing in terms of some variation among district policies is the section of this proposed policy from PSBA that talks about searches involving removal of clothing or examination beneath clothing. So that section of the policy, and again, this is in the form that PSBA has recommended it. There are districts that fall into, I would say, 3 categories if you look at Montgomery County school districts. There are a number of school districts that have adopted this language exactly as it's drafted from PSBA. There are a number of districts that have not adopted the PSBA updated language and have, I would say, an outdated version of the search policy that really talks just about lockers. I think when PSBA initially put its search policy together, lockers were the most commonly searched location, and so it focused a lot on student lockers. A number of districts have not updated their policies, and so their search policies really only talk about lockers. They don't get into other issues that this policy gets into. And then there are a handful of districts that prohibit this sort of search involving searches involving removal of clothing or examination beneath clothing. So different districts take different tacks in terms of how they're going to approach it. The reasoning why that type of search is spelled out in its own section in the policy is that there is a U.S. Supreme Court case involving searches beneath clothing. There was a case in which a student was searched beneath her clothing, and she brought a challenge against the school, and the U.S. Supreme Court said that schools do have the authority to perform searches that involve removal of clothing items or searches beneath clothing items. However, in order to do those searches, there needs to be one of 2 things: either particular information that the location that you're searching is where an item is hidden. So if we just have information that a student possesses an item somewhere on their person, that would not be specific enough to do a search beneath their clothing, because under this policy and under the U.S. Supreme Court case, you need to have specific information that a student, for example, is hiding an item in their underwear. That needs to have been shared with us, or we need to be able to explain why we have reason to believe that it's in that particular location. The other basis upon which we could search underneath a student's clothing or require removal of clothing is if we have specific information that the item or contraband that we are searching for rises to a higher level of risk than other forms of contraband. So in the Supreme Court case and in other cases, take, for example, over-the-counter Tylenol, or Tums. If we have a student who's in possession of some sort of over-the-counter non-prescription drug that poses relatively low safety risk, that would not generally give us the right to search beneath a student's clothing unless we had some information about exactly where they were hiding it in their clothing. Contrast that with if we were informed that a student was in possession of fentanyl or some other substance that provides or produces a significant risk to the health and safety of the student and to other students. That could be a basis to conduct that sort of search. One discussion that we've had is, well, is it necessary for us to have this authority to perform this sort of search if we can just call the police? And that's a reasonable question to ask. It's a reasonable thing to talk about is, well, if we think that a student is hiding something beneath their clothing, couldn't we just call law enforcement? And we could. The only issue that sometimes comes into place, like I mentioned earlier, is that the police are subject to a probable cause standard in order to search someone, which is a higher standard. We only need reasonable suspicion. And so there may be instances in which the police could say, we don't have enough information, enough cause to search this student. Sorry, school, we can't perform this search. It's up to you. If you think you have the ability to perform this search, you can do it. There may be other circumstances where time is a factor. And if if it's necessary to quickly perform a search, it may be better that we have a policy that has specific protocols to be followed in the event of a search beneath clothing or involving removal of clothing to be met. Just to point out, this draft policy from PSBA, in addition to saying, here are the only circumstances in which we can perform a search beneath clothing or involving removal of clothing, it does also require that the solicitor be consulted before any such search is performed, so that there is a level of scrutiny to any instance in which such a search would be performed. So I think that kind of captures some of the discussions, Mr. Fusco and Dr. Bauer, that we've had. But if there's anything else that you want to share based on our discussion, certainly please do.
Sure. So I just want to be clear. Everything was great there, Mr. Summers. Thank you. The line that I'm not sure that I understand in the policy itself from PSBA, right above at the end there, it says handling and disposal of items found in the course of searches. It says searches involving the removal of undergarments or examination beneath undergarments will be conducted only after consultation with the district solicitor. So the parameters set forth above that paragraph, obviously, as long as we're in compliance with that, that's okay. The specific contacting of the solicitor refers specifically to involving removal or examination beneath undergarments. Is that correct? Or is it beneath a sock, for example, or a hat? I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah, that's a good question. The policy language, the language of the paragraph itself is about beneath undergarments, not beneath clothing. So
Okay.
although the heading is searches involving removal of clothing or examination beneath clothing, the policy language itself actually does talk about the higher standard being beneath undergarments.
Okay. Because, for example, just for the committee, as a high school principal, I've encountered several situations where there was something inside of a student's sock, inside their shoe, inside the sleeve of a shirt, and that's beneath clothing, right? It's absolutely beneath clothing, but it's most certainly not inside of undergarments. And I cannot point to an example of where it's gone that far. I can point to one, unfortunately, where we called police because we suspected something was under undergarments. And it was clear there was reasonable suspicion and probable cause. So the police did not have issue asking. It ultimately didn't come down to a search. The student gave up what they were hiding. But yeah, those are just some examples. Mr. Esch?
I'm wondering if we shouldn't bring Safe Schools and Jonathan Casa into this conversation. I'm capable of making a decision, but I would like a little bit more outside expertise in the issue, and I think Jonathan could bring that for us.
Yeah, so
I don't know how board members feel about that.
I'm sorry, Mr. Rush, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that's exactly why we're having a more substantive conversation here. Mr. Fusco felt it might be worthy of the full board, maybe a work session topic at some point. Or we could, run it past Safe Schools as well, get some feedback from them and bring it back to this committee. Kind of just getting the general feel from this committee where they would like to go with this policy. And then we could go from there.
I would say, so one of the things that we had talked about in our initial conversations, and one of the things that I'm still not feeling settled on is in reference to the second point under locker inspection and searches, under searches involving removal and examination beneath clothing, where the last line where it says that the search should be conducted by a person of the, that shouldn't be of the opposite sex, right? So my concern is that, we have a lot of gender identity, and I don't know that how this could be interpreted by an administrator versus by a student who may identify differently than how that administrator has identified them in that moment. So for that reason, I think that it requires a little bit more sort of conversation and deliberate thought about, is there a way to address that specific concern in the policy language itself? And I did have just a couple other questions. I don't expect that to be addressed at the committee level tonight. I'm just saying that's one of my sort of hesitations about it in terms of just that language and what the other members of the board think specific to that. But there is a couple of logistical questions I was kind of wondering about in terms of general searches. We have had canine searches in the building before, and it was as random as it gets. There really was no, it was done as a way to incentivize students not to bring things to school, right? To know that these were going to be these random searches. First of all, has that been happening this year? Is it going to continue if it has or hasn't? And does this language change the approach that we've taken to those canine searches?
No, great questions. I think everything that we've done in those general searches is in accordance with this policy. We provided notification in our student handbooks. We've provided written notification to families that it could happen. And it is absolutely random. You're correct, Mr. Fusco. For example, times that we've done it, we have a list of classroom numbers, and we've used a random number generator and leverage that application. It says room 13, and we go to the list. Room 13 might be classroom B100. So we go there, and again, we don't search students. We search the classroom and their bags that are in the room, that kind of a thing, or lockers. So I believe it is in accordance with this policy. Absolutely. The question of, are we doing it this year? I don't believe we have. Quite frankly, the dog and the handler that we were previously using prior to the pandemic retired. The dog called it a career, and they stopped using him. And so his name was Hunter. So we haven't gone back to it because of the pandemic. So we haven't done it yet this year. I expect that we would, assuming it's the desire of this board, though.
Mm-hmm. Kind of doubling back, just one second, I'm sorry, Tina. Just doubling back to the searches, the dress searches too. I believe on the tour that we took of the facilities the other day, I think it was you made the point to me, since we were walking together, that students don't really use lockers anymore in the high school, right? So I think that that's something to consider as well when we're talking about, this idea of searches, because it's going to be unlikely, whereas in the past it was much more the case, I guess, that items that are contraband, items that are of a danger, are probably more likely to be on the person than they are to be in a locker. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's 100% true. Mr. Nicholson said, I think during that tour, that they used to assign 3,000 lockers, and now they've made it the case that if you want a locker, just ask your home office for one, and we'll give you one. And I believe he said under 300 students out of over 3,000 asked for a locker. They just don't use them. They have a backpack. They keep their belongings with them. Students don't really use their lockers. Some do, but not many. Middle school students use them far more than high school students.
Sorry, Tina, go ahead.
It's okay. As a mom, I'm wondering where they put their coats in the wintertime. But okay.
Yeah, I'm not so sure they wear them all that frequently.
Okay.
And
they still
a lot
wear
of kids
shorts in the wintertime.
Yeah, flip-flops, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So regarding this, I don't. I think it definitely, like what Al suggested, should go to safe schools and then to work session, because I think this is something that's pretty big and would everybody would like to have their input on. So that's what I would like to see. I always struggle with this. Like, I think we want to make sure that we are not becoming prison-like, right? Like I just don't like the thought of that with searches and stuff. Although I know that they're necessary sometimes, but I just, I think I would feel much more comfortable if everybody had their say on it. And as far as the searches, as far, under undergarments, Kyle, you made a comment about how you'd have to contact the solicitor first, but there might be a reason to have to do it quickly. But if I got to contact you quick, first, you might not be around. So like the timeliness factor kind of isn't, a legitimate argument for me. Like, I think then that would be a situation where you want to call in the police, in my opinion. That's how I would see that. I just think that leaves the school very wide open to like, I would not be happy if my kid got searched that way, or if I had gotten searched that way. I don't know.
I think your point.
I want everybody else to have input on it, so that's a touchy subject.
And I think your concern raises what is probably the most important issue, which is regardless of what the decision of the board is that those who are conducting these searches be trained on our new policy to know exactly where that line is and what, you know, their limitations are. And it's sort of easy to say, you know, for us to say, well, no searches that are under undergarments or that would reveal undergarments or that would involve any removal of clothing. In practice, of course, you know, there are all kinds of variables of what people are wearing and where they might tuck things in. And so, you know, I think whatever the outcome of this policy, probably the best thing that we can do is ensure that those who are conducting the searches have been trained about our policy and can try and hopefully think through a lot of these issues, you know, before they're in the middle of searching for some, you know, a illegal substance or, you know, before they have the student right in front of them, you know, if they're more prepared for how to conduct them and what the limits are.
I mean, I'm sure, I know security gets training and everything like, but I think that's also putting them in a very tough situation. Like if, you know, I don't know if they don't do something correctly or whatever. I'm good with the rest of the policy, but that part bothers me.
Yeah, Mrs. Stoll, that's really what makes me uncomfortable as well. Not that I've been doing this forever, but as a former high school principal and assistant principal, I was in that role total for a number of years and conducted many searches, and never once did we have a search inside of or under or have removal of undergarments. We have not had that. Have there been times where I suspected that that's where something was hidden? Yes, but it wasn't as what Mr. Summers described, that there was an extreme risk with the contraband. In the one case, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in the one case that I referenced, we did call the police and it was handled. It was not a problem. So, Mr. Resch, I saw you had your hand up as well.
Yeah. One thing I have with making problem with making a decision here is that I really don't know the number of incidents that happened at the school, what was the result of the searches. I don't know if that data is readily available. I don't want to ask for a report because I know it takes a lot of time and energy on your part. But if that information is available, that would also help us make a decision, I think. I'd like to know how successful you are with searches, whether we got pulled into lawsuits because of unreasonable searches, things like that.
I think Mr. Rush is making a couple important points here, and it's something that I brought up in our conversation, which was, you know, we really have tried to be very deliberate about putting equity lens on all these policies. And, you know, I do think that this is probably one of those data points that is going to be of interest to the board to see just, you know, when these searches are conducted, you know, who are we conducting them on per se. You know, I also think that he's right to suggest that I'm very much interested in hearing what Mr. Casa specifically in Safe Schools has to say, because I am interested in seeing what possibilities exist. I understand the threshold being easier for the district to conduct these searches than police, but I'm also wondering, you know, if there is a search of a student that's beneath an undergarment, you know, should we have it in practice and even in the policy that we will inform law enforcement and maybe even have them present if it's not immediate, you know, it's just, you know, so that there is that added layer of safety and protection that for the student. And like I said, with some of the other language in it with regard to gender and sexual orientation, I suggest that we, at this point, table this one, not move it to a full vote for the board, but rather maybe give Safe Schools an opportunity to take it up and see if they would, after the fact, maybe want to take it to a work session. So, because there's my assumption that the other board members would probably prefer to have a conversation and ask their questions, which is less likely in an action meeting than it is in a work session environment.
Sure. Okay. Yep. I did speak. I just reached out to Mr. Durr. I know our school security department has a fairly robust platform that they use for tracking data, where, when, how, and details of the incidents. And he does have data on searches. So I'll get that together. Maybe we'll put it on the agenda for Safe Schools with Mr. Casa's permission this month or next, and then bring it to a work session thereafter. So I appreciate the committee's feedback on this. This has been very helpful. Mr. Summers, would you recommend that we simply work with Mr. Casa? We don't need to move it to the Safe Schools agenda, right? He could just add it.
You certainly can. If you want to have a motion to refer it to the Safe Schools Committee, that would be an appropriate motion. But certainly, I think the direction of this committee is clear that that's the next step. As far as for the minutes, if you'd like to have it reflected on the minutes, you could do that.
I think I would like to have it reflected on the minutes. So let's just make that motion.
Okay.
All right. So Mr. Resch is motioning to move this policy review to Safe Schools.
I'll second.
By Mrs. Stoll. All in favor? All right. All right. Thank you all. Great questions, and definitely something that I think, again, deserves that extra layer of deliberation and scrutiny. Are there any additional topics that the committee would like to address?
No, thank you. This was great. This is maybe the most substantive conversation we've had in policy in quite a while. So, Mr. Summers, thank you, and certainly to the committee, thank you for your input.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Summers. Thank you, Dr. Bauer, for your input on these topics, these important policies that really, I mean, when you look just at the names of them, you can understand the weightiness of this particular batch. So yeah, a substantive conversation was due. All right, so in summary, we have voted to move 218.2, terroristic threats, 219, student complaint process, 221, dress and grooming, 233, suspension, and, oh, we didn't repeal them. I'm sorry, I'm moving before I did item F. Let me backtrack. Agenda item F is we need a motion to move the repeal of the policies these policies would be replacing to our action agenda. Are any of these regarding the search policy as well? So is that a part of the ones we were intending to repeal or not?
No, it's just one for the suspension and expulsion.
Okay.
I have a quick question about that. Do you mind?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was wondering, did we not have, usually when we're repealing a policy, we have, or, you know, there's a matching one that we're putting in. Did we not have policies before for searches?
There are administrative regulations that detailed the search requirements, but there was not an explicit search policy.
And it's better to have a policy.
It is.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so can we have a motion to move the repeal of these policies to our action meeting? Motion by Mrs. Stoll, seconded by Mr. Resch. All in favor? Okay. Sorry for once again moving ahead too early. All right, so now we've covered additional topics. Now we can move to 218.2, terroristic threats, 219, student complaint process, 221, dress and grooming, 233, suspension and expulsion, and then the notice of intent to repeal policies to our action meeting this Thursday. Is that correct? Is it 2 days from now, right? Okay. And we've decided to move 226 to Safe Schools. So there is only a few minutes left. I noticed that Mr. Patchell did have his hand up in this meeting, and he was very patiently waiting. There is going to be another opportunity to speak, so I'm going to give him the opportunity if he wishes to say something now. Otherwise, he'll be able to speak in about 3 minutes. So, Mr. Patchell, do you have anything you wish to address relative to this committee's agenda?
And Mr. Patchell, if you want to raise your hand, go ahead and do that so I can activate you. Okay, Mr. Patchell, if you're ready, you can unmute, state your name and address, begin your comments.
Oh, here I am.
Here you are.
My name is William Patchell. I live at 404 Bonnie Lane, Lansdale, Pennsylvania. I've listened very quietly to all the presentations here. The ultimate issue is in loco parentis. And I tell you what, there's many students that are very hesitant to return to this changing environment of the high school level anyway. the younger children are very, they're very pliant, and then they go along with everything that goes along. But as they get to that portion of their life where it's more discretionary, I've heard a lot of kids said, why would I want to go back to that place with all these issues, with the possibilities of this and other things happening and things getting out of hand? Why would I even want to go back there? I'm very happy here in virtual. I had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Bauer yesterday at the Northbridge facility. You know what? They're doing a wonderful job. They're not bogged down with all this laborious thing about legal procedure. I think I'm pleading a case before the Supreme Court, for goodness sakes. You know what? They want to come to school. They want to learn. They want to be reintegrated. I honestly think that Northbridge, and I'm so glad that I had a chance to see that facility and I was taken around. That is really an impressive facility. And when all these kids, maybe they want to come back, I don't know. I think they're fleeing to private cyber charter school. Anything that Mr. Summers is talking about will be totally irrelevant. I'm at my house. Don't bother coming to my house. I can do anything I want. My parents are at work. I'm happily here at my computer doing whatever I want to do. I'm having a nice hoagie here, and I'm going about the business of doing education. You know what? By the time they reach that institution over there, which is a middle school, Penndale, some of the kids actually call it Penn Jail. Now, Ms. Stahl, our president, has correctly said, I don't want to create a police state. Well, you know what? All this conversation you're having is, my goodness, I'm going to have serious counsel if anything happens to me. And you know what? I don't want to wind up like Ashley Bennett. Maybe I said something on Facebook that I'm not allowed to say. I wasn't even at school. And you saw what happened to her. I think that case is still pending. Mr. Summer, I'm just bringing it up. You don't have to talk about it. But all this oversee and police state, forget it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patchell. Okay, with that, I'm going to announce that our next policy meeting will be May 11th at 5 p.m. And we are moving to a finance committee meeting. It'll begin and just soon as this one ends. So if there was any other public comment, there's gonna be another opportunity in just a few minutes. So thank you, everyone. Can I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So moved.
All right, thank you, Mrs. Stoll.
I look funny because I had a Frisbee accident. I bike and hit the pavement with my face. So
Playing with his grandkids because he's that great of a grandfather. He sacrificed the body to catch a Frisbee that I think ultimately he didn't catch. All right. Okay, we are adjourned. I'll see everybody in just a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Everybody will need to leave this meeting. Yep.
Leave this meeting and meet at the next.
Thank you.